The remainder of the morning passed in a blur of police statements and hushed family conversations. Claire and Sean provided detailed accounts of their interaction with Ava the previous night, emphasizing her emotional state and the cryptic warning about the pendant being the key to everything. Inspector Nolan seemed particularly interested in this detail, making careful notes and asking them to recall Ava's exact phrasing. By early afternoon, the police presence had thinned somewhat, with most officers departing for the harbor search or to process information at the station. Margaret had retreated to her room, citing exhaustion, while Catherine managed the ongoing police interactions with practiced efficiency. Robert had disappeared entirely, presumably to cope with his grief in private, and Liam alternated between helping officers with logistical requests and staring blankly out windows, his mind clearly elsewhere. "I think we've done all we can here for now," Sean said quietly to Claire as they sat in a small alcove off the main hallway. "We should check with Margaret Byrne, see what information she has." Claire nodded agreement. "I'll let Catherine know we're leaving. She seems to have taken charge in Margaret's absence." They found Catherine in the library, reviewing some documents a junior officer had provided. She looked up as they approached, her professional mask firmly in place, despite what must be considerable emotional strain. "We need to head home," Claire explained, "but please let your mother know we're available if she needs anything." Catherine nodded, setting aside the papers. "Thank you for your help today. Mother values your presence, though I can't imagine this is how you plan to spend your weekend." "Not at all," Sean assured her. "We're glad we could be here, especially under such difficult circumstances." Catherine's composure slipped slightly, exhaustion showing through the cracks. "It's been challenging. First the pendant, then Ava, and now the police crawling through every corner of our lives." "Has there been any update from the harbor search?" Claire asked. "Not yet. Inspector Nolan called to say the Marine unit is still working, but visibility is poor and the search area substantial." Catherine sighed, rubbing her temple where a tension headache was clearly forming. Even if they find it, what then? The damage is done. Ava is gone. The genuine grief in her voice surprised Claire, who had initially perceived Catherine as coldly pragmatic. "You were close to her?" A sad smile touched Catherine's lips. "Not as close as I should have been. Ava was difficult to connect with, always keeping people at arm's length with her sarcasm and provocative behavior. But underneath—" She trailed off, composing herself. "I should have tried harder. Grief often comes with regret," Sean said gently. "But Ava knew you cared." "Did she?" Catherine didn't seem convinced. "Our last interaction was an argument over her behavior at dinner, hardly a loving farewell." Before Claire could offer any comfort, Inspector Nolan appeared in the doorway, his expression grave. "Miss Kerrigan, Dr. and Mrs. Murphy, I've just returned from the harbor." "Did you find the pendant?" Catherine asked immediately. "No," Nolan replied. "The search is continuing, but the harbor is deep in that section, with poor visibility. We may need specialized equipment." "Then why are you here instead of overseeing the search?" Catherine asked, her lawyer's instinct for detecting evasion evident. Nolan entered the library fully, closing the door behind him. "Because we've received the preliminary toxicology results from Miss Kerrigan's autopsy. Dr. Ha Chen expedited them given the circumstances." Sean straightened, his medical training making him particularly alert to this development. "That was fast." "The benefits of a small-town medical examiner who prioritizes suspicious deaths," Nolan explained, "especially those involving prominent families." "Suspicious?" Catherine repeated, her voice sharpening. "I thought the initial assessment was suicide." "That was the preliminary assumption based on the scene," Nolan agreed. "However, the toxicology results indicate Miss Kerrigan had a blood alcohol level of 0.02%, barely a single drink. And while the sleeping medication was present in her system, the levels were relatively low, not enough to be fatal on their own." Claire exchanged a quick glance with Sean, seeing his medical mind already processing the implications. "What did cause death, then?" Catherine asked, her professional demeanor now fully engaged. "Dr. Chen found evidence of respiratory suppression, consistent with oxygen deprivation," Nolan said carefully. "Potentially asphyxiation." The silence that followed was profound. broken only by Catherine's sharp intake of breath. "Are you suggesting," she said, her voice unnaturally controlled, "that my niece was murdered?" "We're investigating all possibilities," Nolan replied diplomatically. "Dr. Chen will conduct additional tests to confirm his findings, but given these preliminary results and the missing pendant, we are treating Miss Kerrigan's death as suspicious." "Suspicious," Catherine repeated, seeming to test the word. "Not definitively homicide?" "Not yet," Nolan confirmed, "but the circumstances warrant caution." "Have you informed my mother of this development?" Catherine asked. "Not yet. I wanted to discuss the situation with the family member currently managing household affairs first." Nolan's respectful tone acknowledged Catherine's de facto leadership role in Margaret's absence. "I'll tell her," Catherine decided. "She should hear this from family, not police." Nolan nodded agreement. "I should warn you. This development means our investigation will intensify. We'll need to interview everyone again, more thoroughly, and we may request access to areas of the house previously deemed irrelevant." "You'll need warrants," Catherine replied automatically, her legal training asserting itself. "Miss Kerrigan," Nolan said carefully, "I understand your professional instinct to protect your family's privacy, but if someone murdered your niece, surely you want that person identified and brought to justice, regardless of who they might be." Catherine flinched slightly at the directness of the question. After a moment, she nodded. "Of course, you'll have full cooperation." As Nolan departed to organize the expanded investigation, Catherine remained motionless, staring at the space where he had stood as though still processing his words. "Catherine," Claire said gently, "would you like us to stay? Help tell your mother?" Catherine seemed to return to herself with effort. "No, thank you. This is a family matter now." She straightened her already perfect posture. "I should find Robert and Liam before informing Mother. They deserve to hear this together." As she left the library with determined steps, Sean turned to Claire, his expression troubled. Asphyxiation presented as an overdose. Someone went to considerable effort to make Ava's death look like suicide. "And the pendant thrown into the harbor around 5 a.m., Claire added, "just an hour before Margaret discovered it missing. The timeline is getting clearer, and it's disturbing." "We need to speak with Margaret Byrne," Sean decided. "Find out what information she has. Then reconsider our involvement in this whole situation." Claire agreed, though she knew extricating themselves from the Kerrigan drama would be easier said than done. They'd been pulled into the vortex of family secrets from the moment Margaret had called them to Thornfield Hall that morning, and the current had only grown stronger with each new revelation. As they left the Kerrigan estate, Claire couldn't help glancing back at the imposing Victorian mansion, its gray stone facades and mullioned windows revealing nothing of the turmoil within. Somewhere inside those walls, a family was about to learn that their grief was now complicated by suspicion, by the possibility that one of their own might be responsible for Ava's death. And despite the sunshine that had finally broken through the clouds, Claire felt a distinct chill as they drove away from Thornfield Hall. Whatever secrets the Kerrigans were hiding, they were deadly ones, and she and Sean were now entangled in their unraveling. Margaret Byrne's cottage sat in sharp contrast to the Kerrigan estate, modest in size but exquisitely maintained, with a beautiful garden that reflected its owner's meticulous attention to detail. As Claire and Sean approached the front door, it opened before they could knock, revealing Margaret herself. "I've been watching for you," she said by way of greeting. "Come in quickly, we have much to discuss." The interior of Margaret's cottage was cozy and traditional, filled with antiques and family photographs. She led them to a small sitting room where tea had already been prepared, suggesting she'd been anticipating their arrival with characteristic thoroughness. "I assume from the police activity at Thornfield that you're now aware of Ava Kerrigan's death," Margaret said once they were seated, dispensing with any preliminary small talk. "Yes," Sean confirmed. "Very tragic. Did you know her well?" Margaret's shrewd eyes assessed them both. Well enough to know that Ava Kerrigan did not commit suicide, and well enough to know that her death is connected to that blasted pendant. Claire wasn't surprised that Margaret already knew about the missing pendant. News traveled quickly in Newcastle, especially among its most observant residents. What can you tell us about the pendant? Claire asked directly, deciding that subtlety would be wasted on Margaret Byrne. It's not what the Kerrigans claim, Margaret replied, equally direct. Never has been. The story about James Kerrigan's grandfather commissioning it in Vienna is a fabrication. You know its true provenance? Sean asked. Margaret sipped her tea before answering. In 1913, a major jewelry heist occurred in London. Several pieces were stolen from the private collection of an aristocratic family with connections to the Russian imperial court. Among them was a cashmere sapphire pendant, 19 carats, surrounded by diamonds in a platinum setting. Claire felt her pulse quicken. The Kerrigan pendant. Precisely, Margaret confirmed. The stolen jewelry was never recovered, until 1948, when a young James Kerrigan suddenly presented his new bride, Margaret, with an extraordinary sapphire pendant that had been in the family for generations. You're suggesting James Kerrigan acquired stolen property, Sean said, frowning. Or his father did, Margaret corrected. The timing suggests the pendant may have changed hands during the chaos of World War II, when records and provenance were often lost or deliberately obscured. How do you know all this? Claire asked, fascinated but skeptical. Margaret smiled thinly. My first husband was a curator at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. He maintained an academic interest in significant lost jewelry. The cashmere sapphire pendant was one he researched extensively. He even had photographs from the original owner's insurance documentation. And you recognized it when you saw it on Margaret Kerrigan, Claire guessed. Not immediately, Margaret admitted. It wasn't until a charity gala in the 1980s, when I got a closer look at the piece, that I realized what it might be. By then, my husband had passed away, but I still had access to his research. Did you confront the Kerrigans with your suspicions? Sean asked. Not directly, but I made discreet inquiries, which apparently reached James Kerrigan's ears. Margaret's expression turned contemplative. Shortly thereafter, he approached me at another function, suggesting we discuss matters of mutual historical interest. He was probing to determine what I knew and whether I intended to expose the pendant's true history. And did you? Claire asked. Margaret's laugh was short and without humor. I was a widow managing a modest inheritance. The Kerrigans were the most powerful family in County Down. What do you think? Blackmail, Sean concluded, remembering the journal entry that mentioned payments to someone identified only as R. I prefer to think of it as compensation for discretion, Margaret corrected primly. James Kerrigan made quarterly payments to me from 1989 until his death in 2008. Not exorbitant sums, but enough to maintain my lifestyle and independence. Claire struggled to reconcile this confession of blackmail with the Margaret Byrne she thought she knew, the woman who had helped expose Donald McKeever's crimes out of a sense of justice. You were R, she said, connecting the reference in James's journal to Margaret's maiden name, which they knew was Richardson. Margaret nodded, unembarrassed by the admission. Indeed. Though our arrangement was more complex than simple extortion, James and I developed a certain understanding over the years. I kept his secret, and in return, he provided financial security and occasional access to social circles that would otherwise have been closed to me. Does Margaret Kerrigan know about this arrangement? Sean asked. No, Margaret replied firmly. At least, not from me. James was adamant that his wife never discover the pendant's true origins. It would have destroyed her faith in him, in their entire marriage. And Margaret Kerrigan is a woman who values appearances above all else. Claire thought about the journal entry, about James's agonizing over decades of deception. But he documented everything, she said, in a safe deposit box that can only be accessed with the pendant itself. Margaret's eyebrows rose in evident surprise. That's new information. How did you learn this? Claire hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Margaret Kerrigan showed us a journal entry James wrote, mentioning a safe deposit box at United Bank, accessible only with the pendant. Fascinating, Margaret murmured. James preparing to reveal his secrets from beyond the grave. I wouldn't have expected such courage from him. But if the pendant is now missing, possibly thrown into Newcastle harbor, Sean began, then the safe deposit box remains inaccessible, and James's secrets remain safely buried, Margaret finished. Convenient, wouldn't you say? The implication hung in the air between them. Someone who knew about the safe deposit box and its contents had taken the pendant, not for its monetary value, but to prevent access to whatever damning information James Kerrigan had documented. Could Ava have known about this? Claire asked. Last night, she told us the pendant was the key to everything. Margaret's expression grew somber. Ava was more observant than her family gave her credit for. She came to see me about 3 weeks ago, asking questions about her grandfather and the pendant. She'd found something in the Thornfield attic, old correspondence between James and me. Did you tell her about the pendant's true provenance? Sean asked. Not specifically, but I confirmed that her grandfather had secrets and that the pendant was central to those secrets. Margaret sighed. I advised her to leave it alone. The past is dangerous territory in families like the Kerrigans. But she didn't, Claire guessed. Evidently not, Margaret agreed. Instead, she started spending time in the old records room at Newcastle Library, researching her family history, notable jewelry thefts, the Kerrigan business dealings during and after World War II. She was piecing it together. And if she confronted someone in the family with her discoveries? Sean left the sentence unfinished, the implication clear. Did you tell the police any of this? Claire asked. Not yet, Margaret admitted. I wanted to understand the situation more fully first, and frankly, I wanted to speak with you both before involving myself officially. She set down her teacup decisively. But given that Ava's death is now being treated as suspicious, I believe I should share what I know with Inspector Nolan. You knew about the toxicology results? Sean asked, surprised. Margaret's smile was enigmatic. I maintain certain connections at Newcastle Hospital. The preliminary findings regarding Ava's cause of death have circulated among those in the know. Claire wasn't entirely surprised by Margaret's extensive information network. During the McKeever scandal, she had demonstrated an uncanny ability to know things before they became public knowledge. There's one more thing you should be aware of, Margaret added, her expression turning serious. The pendant isn't just evidence of the Kerrigan family acquiring stolen property. If James documented everything in that safe deposit box, it likely includes information about how the pendant came into Kerrigan possession in the first place. What do you mean? Claire asked. The original theft in 1913 was never solved, Margaret explained. But James once intimated to me, during a particularly brandy-soaked evening, that his father had direct knowledge of the crime. The suggestion was that Archibald Kerrigan, James's father, may have been involved in the original theft, or at least in receiving the stolen goods. Which would mean the entire Kerrigan fortune could be tainted, Sean realized, built on stolen property and possibly other criminal activities. Precisely, Margaret confirmed. If that information became public, it wouldn't just be embarrassing. It could potentially lead to legal challenges to the Kerrigan holdings. The original owner's descendants might have claims. Tax authorities would certainly be interested in reviewing the family's financial history. So anyone in the family who knew about this would have powerful motivation to keep the pendant and the safe deposit box it opens securely controlled, Claire concluded. Or disposed of entirely, Margaret added grimly, which appears to be what has happened. As they digested this information, Claire's phone chimed with an incoming text. She checked it, surprised to see it was from Catherine Kerrigan. Mother is asking for you both. Please return to Thornfield when convenient. Urgent family matter. She showed the message to Sean, whose eyebrows raised in surprise. That's unexpected. Perhaps not, Margaret commented when they shared the message with her. Margaret Kerrigan is no fool. If she's learned her granddaughter was murdered and her pendant deliberately disposed of, she'll want allies she can trust. And for whatever reason, she seems to have decided that's you. We should go, Claire decided, though not without reservation. The Kerrigan situation was becoming increasingly complex and potentially dangerous. Before you do, Margaret said, rising to retrieve something from a nearby desk drawer, you should have this. She handed Claire a small manila envelope. Inside was a photograph of an elegant sapphire pendant, clearly the same design as the Kerrigan heirloom, photographed against a measuring scale for documentation purposes. From my late husband's research files, Margaret explained. The original insurance photograph of the pendant stolen in 1913. Note the identifying marks on the reverse side, a small maker's mark and a number engraved near the clasp. Claire studied the image carefully. These would definitively prove the pendant's identity if it's recovered. Exactly, Margaret confirmed. And they would support any testimony I might provide about the pendant's true provenance. As they prepared to leave, Margaret added one final piece of advice. Be careful at Thornfield Hall. The Kerrigans have maintained their position for generations by controlling narratives and eliminating threats. Ava discovered this too late. Don't make the same mistake. The warning followed Claire and Sean as they drove back toward the Kerrigan estate, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the winding roads. Whatever awaited them at Thornfield Hall, they were now armed with information that could potentially expose generations of Kerrigan family secrets. And if Margaret Byrne was right, those secrets had already proven deadly. Thornfield Hall was transformed when they returned. Police vehicles lined the circular drive, and uniformed officers moved purposefully around the property. Yellow crime scene tape cordoned off a section of the garden, where technicians in white coveralls carefully examined the grounds. This isn't just about a missing pendant anymore, Sean observed as they parked behind an unmarked police car. They were met at the front door by an officer who checked their identification before escorting them to the library, which had been converted into a full investigation command center. Inspector Nolan looked up from a computer screen as they entered, his expression grim but professional. Dr. and Mrs. Murphy, he acknowledged. Thank you for returning. The family is in the small drawing room. I'll accompany you there. What's happening? Claire asked, gesturing toward the increased police activity. Has something been found? Multiple developments, Nolan replied as he led them through the now bustling house. The Marine unit recovered an object from the harbor that matches the description of the missing pendant, and our search of the grounds has uncovered additional evidence. His careful phrasing suggested the evidence was significant but sensitive, not something to be discussed in the hallway where officers and household staff might overhear. Has Ava's death been officially classified as homicide? Sean asked quietly. Nolan nodded once, his expression somber. Dr. Chen completed his examination. The findings are conclusive. Manual asphyxiation, staged to appear as an overdose. Miss Kerrigan was murdered. Claire felt a chill despite the house's warmth. Suspicion was one thing, confirmation another entirely. And the family, she asked. How are they taking the news? As you might expect, Nolan replied diplomatically. Shock, grief, anger. Mrs. Kerrigan has been remarkably composed, all things considered, but she specifically requested your presence for what she described as a family council. They reached the small drawing room where Nolan knocked once before opening the door. Inside, the remaining Kerrigans were assembled in a tableau of tension and exhaustion. Margaret sat in her usual commanding position, though Claire noted the subtle signs of strain in her posture. Catherine stood by the window, her professional mask firmly in place despite the redness around her eyes. Robert slumped in an armchair, looking shell-shocked, while Liam paced near the fireplace, his movements jerky with nervous energy. And seated slightly apart from the others, pale but composed, was a striking woman Claire hadn't met before. Tall and elegant, with silver-streaked dark hair cut in a stylish bob. Given the family resemblance to Margaret, this could only be the absent daughter, Fiona. Dr. and Mrs. Murphy, Margaret acknowledged their arrival. Thank you for coming. Inspector Nolan, would you give us a few moments of privacy? Family matters to discuss. Nolan hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave potential witnesses alone with the family in the middle of a homicide investigation. Mrs. Kerrigan, given the circumstances. I understand your concerns, Inspector, Margaret interrupted smoothly, but I assure you, nothing discussed will compromise your investigation. Indeed, it may assist it. 20 minutes is all I ask. Something in Margaret's tone, a blend of authority and subtle entreaty, seemed to sway Nolan. 20 minutes, he agreed reluctantly. Then I'll need to resume interviews with family members. As he left, closing the door behind him, Margaret turned her piercing gaze to Claire and Sean. You've been to see Margaret Byrne, she stated rather than asked. Claire didn't bother denying it. Yes, She had information about the pendant. I imagine she did, Margaret replied dryly, given that she blackmailed my husband about it for nearly 20 years. The bluntness of the statement surprised Claire. You knew? Not until this morning, Margaret admitted. After you left, I continued reading James's journal. He documented his arrangement with Margaret Richardson, as she was then known, quarterly payments to maintain her silence about the pendant's questionable provenance. Catherine stepped forward, her professional demeanor cracking slightly. Mother, perhaps this isn't the appropriate time. If not now, Catherine, then when? Margaret cut her off sharply. My granddaughter is dead, murdered. My family's most valuable heirloom has been thrown into Newcastle harbor, and the police are treating every one of us as a suspect. Propriety is a luxury we can no longer afford. Claire was struck by the shift in Margaret's approach, from the woman who had initially sought to handle the missing pendant privately to protect family dignity, to this new, brutally direct version willing to confront uncomfortable truths. You said you wanted our help, Sean reminded her gently. In what capacity? Margaret gestured to two empty chairs, inviting them to sit. As outside observers who have now seen enough of our family dynamics to understand them, but who have no personal stake in our secrets. In short, as honest brokers in what has become a family crisis. Mother believes one of us killed Ava, Liam stated flatly, stopping his pacing to face them directly, and wants you to help determine which of her children or grandchildren is a murderer. The stark phrasing hung in the air, met with varying reactions from the family members. Robert flinched visibly, Catherine's jaw tightened, and Fiona merely watched with calm, assessing eyes. That's an oversimplification, Liam, Margaret corrected. What I believe is that someone in this room knows more than they're admitting about both Ava's death and the missing pendant. And I believe Dr. and Mrs. Murphy, having observed our interactions without family bias, may see connections we are missing. This is absurd, Robert burst out suddenly, rising from his chair with uncharacteristic force. My daughter is dead, and you're arranging some sort of drawing room detective game. We should be planning her funeral, not entertaining amateur sleuths. Sit down, Robert, Margaret commanded, her voice icy. Your grief doesn't exempt you from scrutiny, particularly given your financial entanglements with Ava's accounts. Robert's face flushed deep red. How dare you imply? I imply nothing, Margaret interrupted. I state facts. You've been siphoning money from the family business into Ava's accounts for months, then withdrawing it for your own purposes. Did you think I wouldn't notice? This revelation seemed to shock even Catherine, whose carefully maintained composure slipped momentarily. Robert, is this true? Robert sank back into his chair, the fight visibly draining from him. It's not what it sounds like, he muttered. There were cash flow issues with the business, temporary transfers to manage tax liabilities. Ava let me use her accounts to shelter some funds temporarily. To hide them from creditors, you mean, Margaret corrected sharply, using your daughter as a shield for your financial mismanagement. And when Ava needed money herself, found herself facing eviction and credit card debt, you cut her off rather than admit your own precarious situation. Claire watched this family confrontation with growing discomfort, understanding now why Margaret had wanted outside observers present. The Kerrigans were fracturing under pressure, long-standing tensions erupting in the face of tragedy. Mother, Fiona spoke for the first time, her voice carrying a slight continental accent after years in Paris. This public evisceration serves no purpose. We all have our failings. Robert's financial desperation doesn't make him a murderer. No, Margaret agreed, but it does establish motive, as do Catherine's concerns about the changes to my will and your own estrangement from the family finances. Changes to your will? Catherine repeated, her voice carefully controlled despite the evident shock. What changes? Margaret's expression was almost pitying. Did you think I wouldn't notice your meeting with my solicitor last month, attempting to ascertain whether my recent amendments would affect your inheritance? Catherine blanched but didn't deny the accusation. As your executor, I have a responsibility to understand your estate planning. And as my daughter, you have a responsibility to respect my privacy. Margaret countered, particularly regarding my decision to leave the pendant and a significant portion of my estate to Ava. This revelation landed like a bombshell in the already tense room. Robert's head snapped up in surprise, Liam froze mid-pace, and even Fiona's calm demeanor cracked slightly. "You were leaving the pendant to Ava?" Robert asked incredulously. "Breaking generations of tradition?" "Ava needed stability and purpose," Margaret replied. "Neither of which you provided as her father. I amended my will 3 months ago to make her the primary beneficiary of my personal estate, including the pendant." "And now she's dead," Catherine stated flatly. "How convenient for whoever stood to inherit if she didn't." The implication hung heavily in the air, that Ava might have been killed because of her inheritance, not despite it. Claire glanced at Sean, seeing her own unease reflected in his expression. They had been invited into what was quickly devolving into family accusations and counter-accusations without clear purpose or direction. "Mrs. Kerrigan," Sean said carefully, "while we appreciate your trust in us, I'm not sure how we can help in this situation. These are deeply personal family matters and potentially related to a criminal investigation." "What I need," Margaret replied, her voice steadying, "is clear-eyed assessment. Each of my children and my remaining grandchild has reason to want the pendant for its monetary value, for its traditional significance, or for what it represents in terms of family legacy. But only one of them would have killed for it, and only one of them would have known its true significance as a key." Claire remembered James's journal entry and Margaret Burns' revelations. "The safe deposit box," she said. "You believe someone learned about it and took the pendant to prevent access." Margaret nodded, seeming unsurprised that Claire had connected these dots. "James left clues, it seems, not just in his journal, which remained sealed in his study until yesterday, but perhaps elsewhere. Ava was investigating family history in the weeks before her death. She told me she was untangling a Kerrigan web of lies, though she wouldn't elaborate further." "She came to see Margaret Byrne," Claire offered, deciding transparency was the best approach. "Asked questions about your husband and the pendant. According to Mrs. Byrne, Ava had found old correspondence in the attic and was researching the family history at the Newcastle library." This information seemed to surprise Margaret. "Correspondence between James and Margaret Byrne?" "Yes," Claire confirmed. "About their arrangement." "So Ava knew the pendant was stolen property," Fiona concluded, her gaze sweeping the room. "That the Kerrigan legacy is built on theft. We don't know that for certain," Catherine interjected quickly. "Don't we?" Fiona challenged. "Mother has just confirmed Father was being blackmailed about the pendant's provenance. What other secret could be worth decades of payments?" "The pendant has been recovered from the harbor," Claire revealed, watching for reactions. "Inspector Nolan's team found it this afternoon." The news elicited varying responses: relief from Margaret, tension from Catherine, visible anxiety from Robert, and thoughtful calculation from Fiona. Liam alone seemed genuinely surprised, suggesting he might not have known about the pendant's disposal. "Then the safe deposit box can be accessed," Margaret said, a note of satisfaction in her voice. "Whatever James documented there will finally come to light." "And destroy the family in the process," Catherine added bitterly. "Is that what you want, Mother? The Kerrigan name dragged through courts and newspapers, generations of reputation ruined?" "What I want," Margaret replied with surprising gentleness, "is justice for Ava, and truth, however uncomfortable, about the foundation our family is built upon. We've lived with lies for too long, Catherine. Look where it's led us." The raw honesty of Margaret's statement seemed to affect everyone in the room. Even Catherine's rigid posture softened slightly in the face of her mother's evident pain. "When will the police test the pendant against the safe deposit box?" Robert asked, his voice subdued. "Tomorrow morning," Margaret replied. "Inspector Nolan has arranged for a court order to access the box at United Bank. I will accompany him, as will my solicitor." "And you want us there as well," Claire guessed, understanding now why Margaret had summoned them back to Thornfield. "Yes," Margaret confirmed, "as independent witnesses to whatever we discover. The police will have their perspective, focused on evidence of crimes. I want observers who understand the human element of this situation, the family context." Before anyone could respond to this request, a sharp knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Inspector Nolan entered, his expression apologetic but firm. I'm afraid I need to continue my interviews now, he said, and we have a development I need to discuss with the family. What development? Margaret asked, straightening in her chair. Nolan hesitated, glancing briefly at Claire and Sean before continuing. The pendant recovered from the harbor has been preliminarily authenticated by our forensic jewelry expert. It matches the description and photographs you provided, Mrs. Kerrigan. That's good news, surely, Robert interjected. However, Nolan continued, the expert noted something unusual about the piece. The sapphire itself appears to be genuine, as do the diamonds surrounding it. But the setting, the metalwork holding the stones, is not original to the piece. It's a sophisticated reproduction, likely created within the last 20 years. A stunned silence followed this revelation. Are you suggesting, Margaret finally said, her voice barely audible, that the pendant I've worn for decades is a fake? Not exactly, Nolan clarified. The stones appear to be genuine and valuable, but they've been reset in a modern reproduction of the original Art Deco setting. A very skilled reproduction, but detectable to an expert examining it closely. Claire thought immediately of what this might mean. The original setting, she said slowly, could it have been modified to function as a key? Perhaps with specific dimensions or a unique shape that would activate a mechanism in the safe deposit box. Nolan looked impressed by this deduction. That's one theory our expert suggested. If the pendant itself was designed to physically interact with the locking mechanism of a specific safe deposit box, and someone replaced the original setting with a replica, Sean finished, they would effectively disable the key while maintaining the appearance of the pendant. Margaret's hand went to her throat, where the pendant would normally rest. James, she whispered. He must have had it altered, to ensure the safe deposit box couldn't be accessed even if someone took the pendant from me. Or to ensure you couldn't access it yourself, Fiona suggested quietly. The implication that James Kerrigan had deliberately prevented his wife from discovering his secrets, even after his death, hung heavily in the air. Claire watched Margaret's face, seeing a complex mixture of emotions, hurt, betrayal, but also a strange kind of resigned understanding. The question remains, Catherine said, breaking the uncomfortable silence. Where is the original setting now, and does it still exist? All eyes turned to Margaret, who shook her head slowly. I have no idea. The pendant has looked the same to me for as long as I've owned it. If James had it altered, he never mentioned it to me. Perhaps it's in the safe deposit box itself, Claire suggested, alongside whatever documentation James left. We'll know tomorrow, Nolan said. The court order allows us to access the box at 9 a.m. Mrs. Kerrigan, you're welcome to bring your solicitor and independent witnesses if you wish. His slight pause suggested he understood the delicate family dynamics at play. As the inspector departed to resume his interviews, beginning with Robert in the library, the remaining family members exchanged weighted glances. Years of history, shared secrets, and now new suspicions hanging between them. Will you come tomorrow? Margaret asked Claire and Sean directly. To witness whatever we discover? Sean glanced at Claire, leaving the decision to her. After a moment's consideration, she nodded. Yes, we'll be there. Thank you, Margaret said simply, the two words carrying the weight of genuine gratitude. As they prepared to leave, Fiona approached them near the door, her elegant demeanor a stark contrast to the family chaos surrounding them. A word of advice, she said quietly, ensuring the others couldn't overhear. My mother believes one of us killed Ava. She may be right, but remember, the Kerrigan legacy of secrets spans generations. Not all players in this drama are in that room. Before Claire could ask what she meant, Fiona had already turned away, rejoining her family with the quiet grace that seemed to characterize her movements. The cryptic warning lingered in Claire's mind as they departed Thornfield Hall, the evening shadows lengthening across its imposing facade. In the car, Sean voiced what they were both thinking. There's something we're still missing, some piece of the puzzle that would make all of this make sense. The original pendant setting, Claire agreed. The safe deposit box, the connection to Ava's murder. They're all linked somehow. And tomorrow morning, Sean added grimly, we'll finally learn what James Kerrigan thought was worth hiding for decades, even from his own wife. As they drove back toward their home on Sleve Donard Avenue, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that the worst revelations were yet to come. The Kerrigan family secrets had already proven deadly once. What other consequences might emerge when the final truths were exposed? The next morning dawned clear and bright, a stark contrast to the somber proceedings about to unfold. Claire and Sean arrived at United Bank in downtown Newcastle at 8:45 a.m., finding Inspector Nolan already waiting outside with Margaret Kerrigan and a distinguished elderly man introduced as Mr. Winters, the Kerrigan family solicitor. "Thank you for coming," Margaret greeted them, her composure perfect despite what must be significant emotional turmoil. She wore a simple black dress, mourning for Ava, Claire presumed, but had adorned herself with a single piece of jewelry, a pearl necklace that somehow emphasized the absence of the sapphire pendant she normally wore. "The bank manager is preparing the secure room now," Nolan explained. "We'll be escorted to the vault once he's ready." "Has the pendant been examined further?" Sean asked quietly. "Yes," Nolan confirmed. "Our expert confirmed his initial assessment. The setting is a sophisticated reproduction, likely created between 15 and 20 years ago. The stones themselves are genuine and extremely valuable." "Approximately when James died," Claire noted. "Perhaps he had the setting replaced shortly before his death?" "That's our working theory," Nolan agreed. "Records show he visited a jeweler in London regularly during the last decade of his life. We're attempting to locate documentation of what services were provided." Before they could discuss further, the bank manager appeared, a nervous-looking man in his 50s who seemed uncomfortably aware of the unusual circumstances surrounding their visit. "We're ready for you now," he announced, leading them through the bank's marble-floored lobby to a secure elevator that required his keycard to activate. "The vault level is restricted access. I've arranged a private room adjacent to the safe deposit box area." The descent to the vault level was conducted in silence, each person seemingly lost in their own thoughts about what they might discover. Claire noticed Margaret's hands, steady until now, trembling slightly as she clutched her small handbag. The private room was small but well appointed, with a polished table and comfortable chairs. The bank manager disappeared briefly, returning with another staff member who carried a metal box containing the pendant recovered from the harbor. "The court order authorizes examination of both the pendant and safe deposit box number 472, the manager explained, placing the box on the table. "I understand there may be some question as to whether the pendant will successfully access the box." "That's correct," Nolan confirmed. "We believe the original setting may have been designed to interact with the box's locking mechanism." With careful movements, the bank employee opened the metal container, revealing the Kerrigan pendant nestled on black velvet. Even after its time in the harbor, the sapphire remained stunningly beautiful, a deep, rich blue that seemed to capture light from within. The diamonds surrounding it sparkled under the room's lighting, and the platinum setting, while slightly tarnished from saltwater exposure, remained elegant and intricate. Margaret's sharp intake of breath was the only sound as the pendant was fully revealed. Claire watched her face, seeing a complex mixture of emotions: relief at the pendant's recovery, grief for what it represented, and apprehension about what they might discover. "Mrs. Kerrigan," Nolan said gently, "would you like to examine it to confirm it's your pendant?" After a moment's hesitation, Margaret nodded. The bank employee carefully lifted the pendant by its chain and placed it in Margaret's outstretched palm. She studied it intently, turning it over to examine the back of the setting. "Yes," she confirmed finally. "This is the Kerrigan pendant. Though I confess, I never knew the setting had been replaced. To my eye, it appears identical to how it's always been." "That would have been James's intention," Claire suggested gently, "for you to notice no difference." Margaret's mouth tightened briefly, the only indication of her feelings about this decades-long deception. She returned the pendant to the bank employee with careful dignity. "Shall we attempt to access the safe deposit box?" the manager suggested, clearly anxious to complete this unusual procedure. They were led to the vault area, where rows of safe deposit boxes lined the walls in varying sizes. The manager approached box number 472, a larger box positioned at eye level, and inserted his master key into one of the two keyholes. Normally, the client's key would be inserted in the second lock, he explained. But in this case, according to the court order, we're attempting to use the pendant itself as the secondary key. The bank employee carefully presented the pendant to Inspector Nolan, who examined it closely under the bright vault lighting. The back of the setting, Claire suggested, remembering what she knew about mechanical keys. There might be protrusions or a specific pattern that would engage with the lock mechanism. Nolan turned the pendant over, studying the metalwork on its reverse side. After a moment, he indicated a small section at the base of the setting that appeared to protrude slightly in a distinctive pattern. "This could be it," he said, "though if the setting has been replaced, it won't work." Margaret finished quietly. James ensured that. Nevertheless, Nolan carefully positioned the pendant's protruding section against the keyhole, attempting to engage it with the locking mechanism. As expected, it failed to activate the lock. "As we anticipated," the manager said, clearly uncomfortable with the tension in the room. "Without the original setting, we cannot access the box using this method." "Is there another way to open it?" Margaret asked, her voice steady despite her evident disappointment. "Given the circumstances, a police investigation, court order, and my position as James's widow?" The manager hesitated, consulting briefly with Mr. Winters and Inspector Nolan. After reviewing the court documentation again, he nodded reluctantly. "In extraordinary circumstances, and only with proper legal authorization, we can drill the lock," he explained. "It's a last resort, destroying the locking mechanism, but it will allow access to the box's contents." "A fitting metaphor," Margaret observed with grim humor. "Forcing our way into James's secrets by destroying the barriers he erected to keep them." After obtaining formal approval from all parties, the manager summoned the bank's security specialist, who arrived with drilling equipment. The procedure was loud and somewhat anticlimactic. 20 minutes of mechanical noise resulting in a simple click as the compromised lock finally surrendered. With ceremonial solemnity, the manager slid the long metal box from its compartment and placed it on a nearby table. All eyes fixed on this container that had held James Kerrigan's secrets for nearly 15 years since his death, and potentially decades before. "Mrs. Kerrigan," Nolan said gently, "would you prefer to examine the contents first privately, given that these are your late husband's personal effects?" Margaret shook her head firmly. "No. Whatever is in there has already cost my granddaughter her life. There will be no more privacy, no more secrets. Open it, please." The manager carefully lifted the lid of the box, revealing several items nestled within: a leather portfolio, a small velvet jewelry box, a sealed envelope, and an antique key that appeared much older than the safe deposit box itself. Margaret reached first for the sealed envelope, which bore her name in James's distinctive handwriting. Her hands trembled visibly as she opened it, unfolding several pages of what appeared to be a personal letter. As she read, her expression shifted from apprehension to shock, her face paling visibly. "Margaret?" Mr. Winters asked with concern. "Are you all right?" She didn't respond immediately, continuing to read with intense focus. Finally, she lowered the pages, her blue eyes swimming with unshed tears. "My entire life," she said, her voice barely audible, "has been built on lies." Claire felt a surge of concern for the elderly woman, whose legendary composure seemed finally to be cracking under the weight of whatever revelations James had left for her. "The pendant," Margaret continued, gesturing to the small velvet box. "Open it, please." Inspector Nolan carefully lifted the box and opened it, revealing what was unmistakably the original setting of the Kerrigan pendant. An exquisite piece of platinum metalwork, slightly yellowed with age, but clearly designed to hold the sapphire and surrounding diamonds. Unlike the reproduction currently holding the stones, this setting featured more intricate filigree work and, on its reverse, a distinctive protrusion shaped almost like a key bit. "The original setting," Claire confirmed, her conservator's eye immediately recognizing the authentic Art Deco craftsmanship, and designed specifically to function as a key. "Not just to the safe deposit box," Margaret said, tapping James's letter. "According to this, it opens something else as well, something at Thornfield." "What else is in the box?" Nolan asked, professional curiosity evident in his voice. Margaret gestured toward the leather portfolio. Documentation, it seems, the truth James could never bring himself to tell me in life. Nolan carefully opened the portfolio, revealing a collection of papers, photographs, and what appeared to be official documents. His expression grew increasingly grave as he quickly scanned the contents. "Mrs. Kerrigan," he said finally, "these appear to be records pertaining to the acquisition of various artworks and valuables during and immediately after World War II, including documentation regarding the sapphire pendant's provenance." "Stolen Jewish property," Margaret stated flatly, referencing James's letter. "My father-in-law, Archibald Kerrigan, wasn't just a successful businessman expanding the family shipping enterprise during the war. He was trafficking in artworks and valuables confiscated from Jewish families in occupied territories." The revelation landed with stunning force in the small room. Claire felt physically ill at the implication. The beautiful pendant that had graced Margaret's neck for decades hadn't just been stolen in a 1913 jewelry heist, as Margaret Byrne had suggested. It had been taken from victims of Nazi persecution. "The pendant originally belonged to the Rothstein family of Vienna," Margaret continued, her voice strengthening as she forced herself to articulate the ugly truth. "Confiscated in 1938, then acquired by Archibald through his connections with certain Nazi officials. The sapphire and diamonds are indeed from the 1913 theft in London. They were reset in Vienna in the 1930s for Helena Rothstein as an anniversary gift from her husband." Sean and Claire exchanged shocked glances, while Inspector Nolan quickly processed the legal implications. "This documentation," Nolan said carefully, "potentially constitutes evidence of war crimes and receiving stolen property." "Yes," Margaret agreed with surprising calm. "The foundation of the Kerrigan fortune, the source of our social position and influence, all of it tainted by collaboration with the Nazi regime. James knew this, discovered it after his father's death in 1968, and spent the rest of his life protecting me from the truth while quietly using Kerrigan resources to make anonymous restitution to survivors where he could find them." The payments to Margaret Byrne, Claire realized, they weren't just about keeping the pendant's origin secret, they were about concealing the Kerrigan family's Nazi connections. "Precisely," Margaret confirmed, though according to James, Mrs. Byrne knew only about the 1913 theft, not the subsequent Nazi connection. He paid for her silence about what she knew, while living in fear of what she might discover if she dug deeper. The implications were staggering, not just for the Kerrigan family reputation, but potentially for their entire fortune and holdings. "There's more," Margaret said, returning to James's letter. "The pendant setting doesn't just open this safe deposit box. It also unlocks a hidden compartment in James's study at Thornfield, behind the bookcase, apparently. A compartment containing additional documentation and, most importantly, a list of the families from whom Archibald acquired valuables. James spent decades tracing descendants, making anonymous restitution where possible." "And the antique key?" Claire asked, gesturing to the final item in the safe deposit box. "From Thornfield's original construction," Margaret explained. "It opens the old service tunnels beneath the house. Tunnels where, according to James, Archibald stored the bulk of his illicit acquisitions until they could be discreetly sold or incorporated into the family collection." Inspector Nolan's professional demeanor couldn't quite mask his astonishment at these revelations. "Mrs. Kerrigan, I'm afraid this information significantly expands our investigation. The potential crimes involved go well beyond the theft of the pendant, or even, forgive me, your granddaughter's murder." "I understand," Margaret replied with dignity. "And I will cooperate fully. The Kerrigan legacy of lies ends today." As they prepared to leave the bank, documents and original pendant settings secured as evidence, Claire found herself with a growing sense of clarity about the events of the past 48 hours. "Ava discovered the truth," she said quietly to Sean as they followed the others toward the exit. "Not just about the pendant being stolen property, but about the Nazi connection. That's why she was researching family history at the Newcastle library. And if she confronted someone in the family with this knowledge..." Sean left the implication hanging. "The question remains," Claire continued, "who in the family already knew? Who would kill to keep this buried?" As they emerged into the bright morning sunlight, Margaret Kerrigan turned to them, her expression resolute despite the devastating revelations she'd just endured. "Will you accompany us back to Thornfield?" she asked. "I believe we're about to discover the final piece of this tragic puzzle." Claire and Sean exchanged a glance, both understanding that they had come too far to step away now. Whatever awaited at Thornfield Hall, whatever final truth lay hidden in James Kerrigan's secret compartment or the tunnels beneath the house, they were now irrevocably part of its unfolding. "Yes," Claire replied simply, "we'll come." As their small procession made its way back to their vehicles, Claire couldn't help but reflect on how the missing pendant, initially just a valuable family heirloom, had proven to be exactly what Ava had called it: the key to everything. The key to decades of family deception, to a fortune built on unconscionable origins, and perhaps finally to justice for Ava Kerrigan. What remained to be seen was whether that justice would bring healing or further destruction to a family already fracturing under the weight of its own dark legacy.